Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Mark Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Mark helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Mark draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth. This is your host, Mark Bautis. Today, I'm joined by the Bautis Financial team for one of our book club discussions. If you've been following along, you know that this is an ongoing series where we dive into a book that challenges us, inspires us, or helps us grow, either professionally, personally, or both. It's an opportunity for our team to explore new ideas and share how those ideas can be practically applied in the work we do with our clients and in our own lives. This is our 17th book, and this time we decided to go with Supercommunicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection by Charles Duhigg. Duhigg is also the author of the best-selling book, The Power of Habit: Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. There's so much to talk about how AI is going to replace everyone and how important it will be to interact humans. So that's one of the reasons why I picked this book. Supercommunicators provides great info on how to connect with anyone, how to avoid miscommunication when people are having different types of conversations. It gave some great practical tips on how to bridge divides and improve relationships. You hear all these stories about families and friends not speaking because of their differences in opinions, whether it's politics, could be even sports. The book also provided some techniques on how to be a better listener. One of the things that Duhigg stated in the book is that the best communicators are actually the best listeners. So I'm going to start us off, and I'm going to go over chapter 1, where in chapter 1, Duhigg talks about the matching principle. So what the matching principle is, it's a foundational idea that effective communication occurs when both people are having the same kind of conversation at the same time. So what Duhigg argues is that all conversations fall into one of three categories. And miscommunication often, frustratingly, happens when participants are engaging in mismatched conversations. The first thing you want to do is you want to identify which of the following three conversations you're having with someone. It could be a practical conversation, which is, what's this really about? So that focuses on facts, logic, information exchange, planning, problem solving. It could be an emotional conversation, which is about how do you feel or how do we feel, which that type of conversation is focused on expressing feelings, seeking validation, sharing vulnerabilities. The goal here is empathy and connection, not finding a solution to something. Or it could be a social conversation, which is like, who are we? Where you're focused on identity, group dynamics, relationships, and how we see ourselves and others in the world. So how the matching principle comes into play with these, it's first identify the type of conversation that you're having, and then you want to consciously adjust your style and goals to meet that of the partner that you're having that conversation with. Classic example is when one person's venting about their job, which is an emotional conversation, and their partner that they're having the conversation with, they respond with a list of immediate solutions or advice, which is a practical conversation. And what happens here is there's a disconnect, and it leads to frustration because the person who's venting about the job, they're looking for validation probably, and that was never met. So as a super communicator, or how you would handle this, is upon recognizing that the other person is seeking emotional connection, you want to match that. You want to offer empathy, asking how they feel, try to understand, summarize what you heard them say rather than immediately giving advice. In that moment, they're not really looking for advice. And then what Duhigg says is that when both parties match the conversational type, this can lead to neurological synchronization, where your brains actually begin to align, making a connection and a mutual understanding possible. One thing I liked about this book, and a lot of the books we read, is that they often accompany the topic for the chapter with a story. In this chapter, Duhigg gives the story of Jim Lawler, who's a CIA officer. And he talks about Lawler, the CIA officer, who initially he struggled to recruit spies in the early 1980s. Despite he received training, his interactions with all these potential assets, they were awkward, they were unsuccessful. And the reason is that there was a mismatch. Lawler initially focused on the practical goal of getting information, recruiting spies, but he failed to connect with people on that human level. So what Lawler eventually learned is that successful communication, even with potential spies, it required him to generally create a genuine human connection. It helped when he shared his own vulnerabilities and when he listened deeply to the other person's anxieties and hopes, which shifted the conversation to an emotional or a social type. Now, I know in these two examples, we've talked about how the conversation wasn't emotional. It's not always going to be that way. It could be any one of those three. It's not about manipulation or trying to get what you want out of it. It's really recognizing what conversation the other person's having and then aligning your own communication to show that you genuinely want to connect with them. The last thing I'll bring up is Duhigg. He included a personal anecdote about his own communication struggles, where he had a frustrating mismatch with his wife, where he would vent emotionally about a problem and she would respond with a practical solution, leading to conflict instead of connection. So I know a lot of this, we talk about these books and how we can improve, our work and our professional lives, but obviously improving our communication skills can help personally as well. All right, so I'm going to turn over the next section to Kayla to talk about how every conversation is a negotiation.
Yeah, my chapter was the second one, and Duhigg's whole point is that every conversation is basically a negotiation. And it's not like a back and forth where both parties are trying to get something out of the interaction. It's more of like both parties are trying to work through three different types of the negotiation. The first one that he breaks down is information, and this is when someone wants the facts or an explanation. The next one is emotions, and this is when someone just wants to feel heard or understood. And then the third one is expectations, so figuring out what the next steps or the plan is. And then he was explaining that conversations fall apart when these get mixed up. So he used the example of someone vents after a long day and they're negotiating emotions, but then if the other person jumps into problem solving, that's the information response. So when there's a mismatch, it can create conflict. It's not that anyone's actually upset, it's just that two different conversations are happening at the same time. And then he talks about how super communicators are just quicker at spotting which lane the other person's actually in. And then he uses the example that the first sentence or just their energy tells you everything. You could just simply ask, do you want advice or do you want me just to listen? And then that could keep things from going sideways. At the end of the chapter, he gives a guide and he gives a few takeaways there. You can ask the other person clarifying questions so you know what lane you're in. In your head, you can label the type of conversation, so informational, emotions, or expectations. And then he also suggests not to jump between modes too quickly and to stay in the one that you're actually in. So I think the main takeaways of this chapter were that conversations can get easier when you figure out what someone is really negotiating for. And then if you match their type, you can not talk past one another, and that can help things flow a lot better.
Yeah, I think it builds on that first chapter of really understanding the conversation you're in or the communication you're in, and how to adjust to the other person that's in that conversation with you. So I thought it was a good chapter. Okay, next we'll have Kira talk about the listening cure.
Yeah, so in the third chapter, it opens at a hedge fund conference in Connecticut, attended by finance professionals. And despite their financial knowledge, they are not known for their emotional listening skills, which matters a lot in their world. And they're there to hear Nicholas Epley. Generally, the chapter makes the case that listening is not just passive, it's an active, emotionally engaged process. And here are some takeaways from Epley's psychology of listening. So he discourages superficial listening tactics. Some examples of this are forced eye contact, robotic nodding, or even saying uh-huh and yeah when someone's speaking. He talks about how that can actually undermine true communication. And instead, he emphasizes making the conversation genuinely interesting by asking deeper questions, especially about emotions, values, and life experiences. He draws on a psychological research method called the fast friends procedure, which in that pairs answer increasingly personal, emotionally intimate questions, and this promotes trust and closeness. And the idea is that vulnerability, like sharing your real feelings, triggers emotional contagion, which is when someone else opens up, listeners tend to mirror that feel that emotion too, which builds connection and invites them to open up as well. So another takeaway from this chapter is the method of looping. So looping is a three-step process where you ask a meaningful question, you paraphrase back what you heard from the person you're communicating with in your own words, and then you ask for confirmation so that the speaker can correct or clarify. So that would be like, did I get that right? And this creates a moment of shared understanding and builds psychological safety so that when people feel genuinely heard, they're more likely to listen back to what you have to say, which I thought that this was a really important point because I feel like sometimes when we're communicating with people and in the process of listening to them, we're sort of just thinking about what we're going to say next. And instead of if you employ this looping mechanism, you are more focused on hearing what they're going to say, paraphrasing it to them. And then once you ask them, did I get that right? And they confirm, then is when you can think of your response. So I really think that in real life, that's something that we could utilize more. So, three main takeaways from this chapter were that deep listening built around emotion isn't just nice to have, it's a skill that can foster better, more authentic relationships. The second is by asking emotional questions and reciprocating vulnerability and using techniques like looping, you can improve your capacity to connect. And that this kind of listening matters not just in high stakes business settings, but in everyday relationships, sort of like Mark touched on, because it helps people really feel seen, understood, heard, and safe.
Yeah, Kira, I agree with you on looping, and sometimes I subconsciously feel myself doing it in the conversations we have. And one, it's good, like you mentioned, because it forces you to focus on and not think about the next thing you're going to say. But also because our conversations, a lot of times they're around money, finances, it's emotional. You want to make sure you understand what the person is trying to communicate on their side, which sometimes can they may not be sure how to bring it up because it is an emotional topic a lot of times. So looping is a great way to really make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, next up we have Dylan to talk about how do you hear emotions no one says aloud.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I chose a chapter, Hearing Emotions No One Says Aloud. And I feel like most people don't express their real emotions directly. And that's not necessarily because they're hiding them, but because emotions are complex and they're hard to articulate. Even when no words are spoken, emotions will leak out through like your tone, your posture, your energy, your mood, etc. And I think like the biggest example, like the classic case that you could think of to this is like, I feel like everyone's had a case where a friend said like, oh yeah, I'm fine, but they sound deflated or just don't look themselves. And you know that something's wrong behind the surface. Another story that relates to that, this book presents a story that resonated with me about how NASA was screening like potential astronauts for longer duration missions. And NASA realized that technical skill and intelligence wouldn't be enough to just screen the astronauts for these long duration missions. And they would need to conduct emotional intelligence screenings to ensure that the astronauts can get along with each other under stress and through the isolation of space. While all the candidates looked great on paper, they concluded that it became difficult to like distinguish who had real emotional intelligence and who was acting as if they did. So they developed this simple test during like interviews to screen for this like emotional intelligence. And the interviewer would walk into the room carrying a stack of papers and would trip and drop them on the floor. And after the interviewer would do this, they would pause and let out a big laugh. They'd wait a second, and the interviewer would observe closely and see how the candidate would respond. Did they laugh back genuinely? Did they match the interviewer's energy or tone? And what they learned from doing this is that the candidates that would match the interviewer's energy and mirrored their energy that was projected towards them were the ones that really exhibited real emotional intelligence and the ones who adapted better socially over these long missions. And this method showcased how nonverbal cues matter a lot. Someone can say all the right words, but their body language may betray the words they convey. And this test wasn't meant to be judgmental or to trick the candidates. It just gave them a space to show their true authenticity. And the way that people respond to emotional cues can reveal something deeper than words ever could. This chapter and some of the other stories throughout the book have taught me that authenticity beats charm. Superficial friendliness and polished speeches will only get you so far. What really moves people is showing genuine and authentic emotion rather than being manipulative. And vulnerability often invites vulnerability. Thinking back to the story about that Mark mentioned before about the CIA director, he showed vulnerability to the people that he was interviewing or the people that he was talking to. And when you share something sincerely, the other person is more likely to respond authentically. And that builds trust and it helps grow a deeper connection. And super communicators succeed because they engage with the emotional reality rather than the surface level conversation.
You were talking about nonverbal cues. And when I was reading it, one of the things that I thought of was like how we communicate with people, right? There could be a simple text, right? It's written down, and a lot of times you don't know what the context of is that, of what they're trying to say. Then they could email something, and it's a little bit long, probably longer, but still written down and still easy to misconstrue what they're saying. Then you can have a phone call, but you're still not getting nonverbal cues. You could have a Zoom meeting like this where we're virtually seeing each other, and then there's that in-person meeting. And a lot of times with that in-person meeting is where you can really get a feel for those, nonverbal cues of what someone's conveying, and it helps a lot in making sure like you're utilizing some of the techniques that Duhigg talks about with matching and emotional intelligence in person, where you can't get that in some of the new ways that people like to communicate. All right, John, you're up next with how to connect amid conflict.
This chapter really resonated with me, and like I think it would with a lot of people in this world of social media and conflict and disagreement. And it feels like, even as a side note, that the polarization we're seeing in the world right now, whether it be politics or just anything in our lives, just seems to be getting even more evident. And this chapter addresses that directly. Often at a personal level, I feel like when I'm having a conversation with somebody who disagrees with me, if I take a step back, sometimes I think this is crazy, because I feel like we have more in common, and we're trying to achieve the same thing. And trying to just point those things out doesn't do anything. Much like most of the time you have these conversations and disagreements, they usually go nowhere. You have those conversations, you say nobody's changing their mind. And this chapter really addresses the idea that we have these opposing beliefs, and we typically aren't going to change our mind, but how do we continue the conversation and continue to communicate effectively when we hold these deeply opposing beliefs? And one of the other things I really like about the book is he has a really great way of using. I always like when authors use real life examples of how, whether it be studies or real life examples, to kind of get their point across. And I thought he did a great job, especially in this chapter. He taught the way that the example that he uses is this study that ultimately the point of the study was to look at how people have opposing beliefs. And they took one of the most polarizing topics that you could potentially think of, with gun control and guns. And they found a group of advocates on both sides of this issue and brought them together, and were put together a way for them to interact and kind of study and put them in situations where they could potentially have better outcomes in these conversations. A lot of it does touch on a lot of the things many of you have already talked about, where, looking at some of these communication skills and emotion, and tying into emotion and how important that is. And ultimately these two sides of these advocates on both sides sat down. And in the end, what really, I mean, to just kind of jump into the point, like in the end, unless there was an emotional connection, the conversation went nowhere. I mean, at the highest level, that's really what they're getting at. And in order to do that, there has to be certain things present. the one that kind of stood out to me the most was, just being able to prove that you're listening. And this goes back to what Kira was saying about how, this looping, and there's different techniques, but just to truly have that person not just sitting there and looking at them and doing, just looking like you're listening is really enough. There has to be this like kind of breakdown of walls, and it usually comes with some of these techniques and finding a way to connect emotionally and get the other person talking about truly why is this an issue to them, because many times it's not the actual facts themselves. A lot of times it's like their personal history, their community identity. There's a feeling of safety and autonomy, or cultural belonging. And there's these very, very deep embedded things that are about them. And in a lot of ways, that really reminded me of our business. People will come to us and many times, and they think they're like, hey, I want this, or this is, I think, is the problem. But when you really, really have that conversation and you really get to know that client and really look into it, you kind of see like there's something that maybe happened in the past, or there's something that's very embedded into who they are and their life experiences that lead them to wanting this certain thing about their financial plan or this certain thing addressed. And I think that it's a lesson to be learned about a lot of the things that we're looking at is, the way that we the things that we're looking for, the things that are important to us. Those obviously are things that, and we even use this idea of an advice value stack, where we look at, hey, these are, there's investments, there's all these things that we're doing, but at the end of the day, we're doing those things for these like higher meaning type things. And I think a lot of times it's like tapping into those higher meaning, or those things that are really embedded in us, that are affecting or forming this opinion that we have about, let's say, guns. In the example, when those who were having the conversation on both sides of this issue, when they were able to really say, hey, look, this is really, get that kind of out there, and they were both sharing some of these stories and their life experiences, those walls came down. And the cool thing is to hear that by the end of this experiment, both sides were almost like friends, and like some of them were even in tears, and they still actually still stay in touch. And it wasn't about, they still disagree, but they have a deeper respect for the other person as to why they have that opinion. And I think that is really what is important to keeping the conversation going. If that doesn't exist, and the facts are just thrown back and forth, that typically things get nowhere. And I don't think there's anybody out there listening to this, and even all you guys here, that you haven't been in that situation where you're just butting heads and you're just going nowhere. But it does, especially on, it's a joke amongst many that, on social media, where like you chime in and it's like, this is pointless. Like, why am I even here? Why am I even saying this? Because it's not going to go anywhere. Because it's just back to that, is just that unless there's this idea of breaking down these walls and connecting emotionally and just really, really trying to express yourself and the reasons why you feel that way, that it usually goes nowhere. So, in the end, the idea of trying to figure out ways for us to approach these difficult conversations, I thought it was really, really eye-opening and applicable.
Yeah, I mean, my overall thoughts on the book, I thought it was really good. As some of the stuff is like common sense that you should be doing, you should be trying to practice this or do this. One of the things I've tried to like think about is, all right, how do I implement some of this stuff? Like with anything, the more you do it, the better you get at it, the more natural it becomes, the less forced it feels. And like my thoughts are, okay, do I pick one or two things out of the book and try them? Do I role play them? Find someone and role play them with them. But I think that's really the only way to kind of, go from reading to actually, reading about something, learning about something, to actually utilizing it as a skill. Is just, you have to use it, and it starts off maybe feeling a little forced on your side to try and do it, but eventually it'll get more natural. And maybe, like, I was talking about looping earlier, maybe that's how looping started, where now it's a natural technique, but maybe initially it was something that was more forced and more, I was more conscious of doing. But yeah, I think there are definitely some techniques in the book, or skills or strategies in the book, that could be utilized to improve our conversations. All right, so that's all we have for today's book club. I want to thank the Bautis Financial team for being on. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm not sure what our next book will be, but we'll have that one recorded shortly. Yeah, if anyone would like to set up a call, talk about communication, or more importantly, finances and money, you can do that at bautisfinancial.com/call. Don't forget to follow the Agent of Wealth on the platform you listen from and leave us a review of the show. We're currently accepting new clients, and if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one consultation with our advisors, please do so at bautisfinancial.com/call.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.